One of the problems with fluoridation is that whenever a fluoride expert changes his mind about the alleged benefits, all the other people jump on him, try to discredit him or her, call him bad names, and go after their credentials. That's why there's so little dissent regarding water fluoridation. One of those experts was John Colquhoun. John was in charge of the fluoridation of New Zealand until he took a worldwide tour in 1980 and discovered that there is no benefit. And then he did a study in New Zealand and found there was no benefit there either. And the rest of his colleagues began to call him names, and the job he had as fluoridation expert went away. But John found another one. He became the editor of the journal Fluoride, a peer-reviewed journal, and contributed an enormous amount of information to the science of fluoride. This is one of his last interviews with Paul Connett.
I'm here in Auckland, New Zealand, and I'm here to interview Dr. John Colquhoun on the fluoridation issue. Dr. John Colquhoun at one time was the principal dental officer for Auckland. At that time in his life he was pro-fluoridation, and we will find out why he changed his position to now a strong anti-fluoridation position. For many years he's used his expertise in the editing of the journal Fluoride. So John Colquhoun knows a lot about the fluoridation issue, and I'd like to share that information with you.
I was so successful as an advocate of water fluoridation that my superiors in Wellington approached me and asked me to make a world study tour, undertake a world study tour on fluoride research and the subject of water fluoridation, which I agreed to do. At the end of this tour I was to come back and become the health department's expert on fluoridation and lead a campaign to introduce water fluoridation to those parts of New Zealand which had resisted having it added to their water.
And which countries did you go to?
Well, I went to Australia, North America, Britain, several European countries, and Asia, Thailand, Philippines. And I spoke and discussed at length the issue with prominent researchers like Professor Newbrun in San Francisco, and in England, Professor Jenkins and Professor Gunn.
And how long did this take, this tour?
Now, it was I was away 4 months. Mm-hmm. Now, I should explain that before I left, my superiors confided to me some worries they were having about the effects of fluoridation in New Zealand. You see, that from the records they were now gathering, as I had earlier gathered in Auckland, the treatment records of children in New Zealand, they were very surprised to find that tooth decay was declining as much in the non-fluoridated places as it was in the fluoridated areas. But they felt that if they started to collect more comprehensive data, figures for every child, instead of as they had been collecting samples from different communities, that this would show that there was a better state of oral health in the fluoridated areas than the non-fluoridated areas. They agreed that it wouldn't be the 50 or 60% difference which we had claimed would result from introducing water fluoridation, but that there would be a significant difference nonetheless. Now, I accepted that, really, being a keen pro-fluoridationist, and when I went on the tour, I found the same thing was happening in other countries. It was confided to me that there wasn't the difference between the fluoridated and non-fluoridated areas which they expected. But again, they felt that more thorough and comprehensive surveys would show that there was a significant difference, because they were convinced, as I was convinced, that fluoridation must be the most effective way to reduce tooth decay. Now, when I returned home, I was expounded the views of the researchers I met. They thought, as my superiors in New Zealand had thought, that the decline in the non-fluoridated areas must be due to the increased use of fluoride toothpastes, fluoride supplements, clinical uses of fluoride, and we had done all these things in New Zealand in the school dental clinics. And this satisfied us that the lesser difference was due to that, and that we were sure we could show that water fluoridation was better than these other methods. Of course, when we had been advocating fluoridation, we had told the public that water fluoridation was the only way to effectively reduce tooth decay. However, we satisfied ourselves with this argument. Now, I realise now, of course, that I and my colleagues were doing what professionals have done throughout the history of science when their pet theory is suddenly challenged with evidence which is embarrassing to them. We fell over backwards to explain away the evidence. Now, when I got back, I was duly appointed chairman of a National Fluoridation Promotion Committee, and our task was to see that all New Zealand was fluoridated as soon as possible. Now, to do that, of course, I had to gather information and data, and the first thing I did was to have a look at the treatment statistics that had been gathered from my own district compared to the non-fluoridated part of the district. And these new statistics, incidentally, were collected while I was away. And when I got back, I had a look at them. And to my astonishment, there were fewer fillings needed in the non-fluoridated part of Auckland than in the fluoridated. Fewer fillings, yes. Which, as you can imagine, to a keen fluoridator, caused some concern. So I contacted the districts to the north and the south of me and asked the principal dental officers there for their figures which had been collected. And they showed the same picture. It wasn't such a big difference, but the teeth was slightly better in the non-fluoridated part of the district than in the fluoridated part. So I then decided to ask my superiors in Wellington to supply me with the figures for the whole country, which they had collected, as I knew when they were away, and these figures were sent to me. The treatment statistics for all children, all 12 and 13-year-old children in New Zealand, from every health district in the country. And written across the top of the list was an instruction to me that the figures were not to be made public. And when I examined them, I believe now I realise why that instruction was there. In most of the health districts of New Zealand, the percentage of children who had perfect teeth had required no treatment at all. That percentage was greater in the non-fluoridated part of the district than in the fluoridated part. More children with perfect teeth in the non-fluoridated area than the fluoridated area. And that was true for most of the health districts of New Zealand. That was in the year 1981, the year after I returned from my study tour. Well, I had been instructed when I was appointed chairman of this Fluoridation Promotion Committee to tell the members of my profession and the public that teeth were better in the fluoridated areas than they were in the non-fluoridated areas. Well, I did not carry out that instruction. Instead, I wrote to my colleagues in North America who had told me that they were carrying out similar large-scale surveys and asked them for the results of those surveys.
Now, would that have been the National Institute of Dental Research?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I had interviewed them when I was there, and they told me that they felt sure that this new survey would show the benefits of fluoridation. Incidentally, they were never published at that stage, and they didn't answer my letter. Years later, of course, Dr. John Yamianis in America used the official information legislation in America,
Freedom of Information Act.
Freedom of Information Act,
yeah,
to extract that information, and then he published a paper in Fluoride, a journal which I now edit, showing that there was virtually no difference in the decay rates in the fluoridated and the non-fluoridated parts of the United States, which was the same picture I had found here.
And his article is actually also published in the Chemical and Engineering News, or at least a report of the article.
A report of the article, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The Chemical Engineering News has been quite good in reporting both sides of the question of fluoridation. Well, by this time I was dragging my feet, not because I believed that fluoridation would do any great harm, because I was still quite believed that it was perfectly safe, it couldn't possibly harm anyone, but if it wasn't giving the benefit which we thought it would give, what was the point in campaigning for it? And in fact, the teeth seemed to be, when I compared similar kinds of communities, like similar low-income communities, the teeth seemed to be better in the non-fluoridated part. But as I found later, there was more tooth mottling, more disfiguring dental fluorosis caused by ingesting fluoride in the fluoridated part. So what was the point of campaigning for something like that? However, it wasn't until some of my staff drew my attention to this kind of mottling that was occurring with increasing frequency in orchid children. A mottling of the teeth along the growth lines of the enamel, symmetrical, same on each side of the mouth, which answers the description of dental fluorosis, the kind of chronic poisoning, a sign of chronic poisoning caused by fluoride ingestion. And when I had a look at the children's teeth, I found teeth like these, mottled with some of the brown discoloration which is characteristic of the severe degree of this disease. I reported this to my superiors, who just wiped the idea away. It couldn't possibly be fluoride. Fluoride doesn't do that. Fluoride only causes very mild mottling in a tiny minority of children. So I did a survey before I retired. This was now in the year before my retirement at the end of 1983. And so I did a survey, a large-scale survey. In fact, I examined all the children in the non-fluoridated area because it was a smaller populated area, and a large number in the fluoridated area with the assistance of my staff. And this material was eventually published, but it showed that a quarter of the children in fluoridated Auckland had this kind of mottling, dental fluorosis, which the early literature described as a sign of chronic fluoride poisoning.
Now, what's your response to scientists or dentists in the United States, and I think in Britain, who claim that this staining, this kind of staining, is caused by tetracycline?
Well, that's an absolute nonsense. Tetracycline staining is a quite different appearance, absolutely different. Now, if you read reputable text on dental fluorosis, there is only one cause of this particular kind of mottling. Bilateral, diffuse mottling along the growth lines of the enamel. No other cause has been demonstrated but ingestion of fluoride. And the propaganda ruse that is being resorted to tell people an outright lie that there can be other causes of this condition is just that, lying propaganda. I could not persuade my superiors to do anything about this situation. And finally, I appeared on national television and showed them these pictures of the children. I had the children there, I brought the television camera into the clinics, and we took pictures of the teeth, and we showed the nation what fluoride was doing to the children's teeth. Of course, that did cause an uproar.
That must have been tough for you to do, John, because you had been promoting this, and you were essentially saying, hey, here's the result of what I've been doing myself.
Well, when you work in a health service and are promoting the health of children, and in my case the oral health of children, and you suddenly discover that what you've been doing has been poisoning those children, that was the crucial point in my career when I became publicly opposed toward fluoridation. I then went on to study other aspects, and I learned that there are many other harmful effects for which there is a great deal of evidence, perhaps not conclusive proof, but if there is strong evidence or even the possibility of other forms of harm, how can you possibly justify advocating giving a dose to everyone in the community, old people, young people, infants, the whole lot, in the water supply, when there is some possibility of harm as well as this mottling of the teeth? I came to realise that what I should have realised much earlier, that common sense tells us that if a poison circulating in a child's body can cause a disturbance in the formation of its tooth enamel, it is very, very likely to cause other harm to other parts of the body, and there is now growing evidence that this is so. Now, I was now publicly opposed to fluoridation. I had retired, and I wrote to the Auckland Regional Authority, which was the authority responsible for our water supply, and I stated in a letter that I believed it is possible that the damage was not only to the children's teeth but to their bones, to their skeleton. And this was ridiculed. Scorn was poured on this suggestion. My colleagues said that the only possible effect, deleterious effect of fluoride was this mottling, that couldn't possibly at 1 part per million in the water get any other effects. Well, 6 years later, the first of the studies, there have now been about 7 of them, the first of the studies appeared which reported an association between increased hip fractures in the elderly and water fluoridation. And as I say, there have now been 7 studies reporting this association. And what has surprised me most, Paul, is the stubbornness with which my colleagues cling to their belief. Not all, there are some honourable ones who have stated they were, and changed their stance, but they don't get much publicity, and the majority of the profession are still thoroughly committed, almost like a religious belief, to belief in this procedure of water fluoridation. But I found that appearing at about the same time, there were clinical studies showing that fluoride, when used in an attempt to treat the condition of osteoporosis, that's the rarefaction of bones in mostly elderly women, that carefully controlled clinical trials had shown that fluoride did cause more hip fractures in these patients who were given the fluoride. So we know that fluoride is only partly excreted. Any fluoride you taken is partly deposited in the bones and the rest excreted. And over a long period of time, the levels of fluoride in old people's bones have shown to be the same as occurs with this treatment for osteoporosis, with higher doses for short periods. So there is evidence of a causative link. And of course, it's not only hip fractures that new evidence has accrued for. There's long been a debate about the possible cancer-causing effect of fluoride. But the most recent and most telling evidence, I think, was about 5-6 years ago, studies reported that in male rats there was an increase in the rare bone cancer called osteosarcoma, which affected the males and not the females. And again, my colleagues rubbished this and said, oh, but that's only equivocal evidence, it doesn't necessarily relate to human beings. And almost immediately it became apparent from data collected by the National Cancer Institute in the United States, collected from every cancer registry in the United States, covering 10% of the entire population, that this same rare bone cancer, osteosarcoma, had increased in young males and not in the non-fluoridated areas. It increased in fluoridated areas and not in the non-fluoridated areas. Now that animal experiment showing that effect, followed by epidemiological studies showing a relationship between increased osteosarcoma and water fluoridation, it is claimed it is not conclusive evidence. Well, maybe it's not. No, it seems pretty strong evidence to me, but even if it's not conclusive, it has to be admitted that the possibility is there. Now, I know mothers whose sons have died from osteosarcoma, teenage boys. Is one death of a teenage boy from osteosarcoma an adequate exchange for saving a part of a cavity in a child's tooth? And I think when you put that issue to the lay public, they're mostly common sense people, and they say no. If there's the slightest possibility of harm, we shouldn't be adding it to the water, even if it does prevent cavities, for which there is now considerable doubt.
Just to follow up on the osteosarcoma story, I understand that I think it was Dr. Colquhoun in New Jersey did a 7-county study and a 3-county study in New Jersey, and they found a considerable increase. 3 to 7 times more osteosarcoma in the fluoridated areas of New Jersey than in the unfluoridated areas. And yet Dr. Colquhoun, who was a public health official, went on to say that this is not conclusive evidence and we should carry on with fluoridation. Now, when we point out this evidence that there has been this association, our opponents reply by saying, oh, but the authors who produced this data said that we should carry on with fluoridation. But that is the opinion of those authors. The data presented by those authors, which cannot be evaded, will be interpreted differently by a person who's not a keen fluoridationist. And actually, again, common sense tells us if there is an increase in osteosarcoma in fluoridated areas, and element experiments have indicated a link, a causative link, it amazes me how we can carry on adding it to the water supply. I get the impression that the many doctors and dentists in the United States, and possibly elsewhere, are intimidated by this status quo position. We've been putting fluoride in the water now since 1945. Don't rock the boat. Is that what you feel too?
I do, because I do know instances of professionals who have confided to me that they agree with me, and then later on I find them taking a public pro-fluoridation position. And the intimidatory pressures are very strong. I can understand that when your career's ahead of you and you have a family to support and a house mortgage to pay, the pressures are very strong to perhaps shut up. But I do not understand how they can go on publicly advocating something when they're intelligent people who know that they're advocating something which must be wrong. As I put it to my colleagues, look, here we have before our eyes the situation in New Zealand where teeth are just as good with or without fluoridation, and we have more mottling where there's water in the wood. Why don't you judge your position on the evidence before your eyes? But I'm afraid in professions there's a tendency to rely on the textbooks that you read on your training and what your precious authorities, the people of course whose reputation is on the line and have a vested interest in defending the orthodoxy, they listen to them rather than use their own thinking powers.
Now, in your particular case, you looked at in fine detail, with an enormous amount of data, what was happening in New Zealand. Yes. Meanwhile, we have some other, if you like, more common sense type data from around the world. Very few countries actually fluoridate. Yes. I mean, half the people drinking fluoridated water actually live in the United States.
Yes.
We have 10%, I think, in Britain, 60% in Ireland, but most other European countries do not fluoridate.
No.
And based on what I've read, and I'd like to get your reaction to it, there isn't an evidence that the whole countries that are not fluoridating, have worse teeth than countries that are fluoridating.
No, actually, the evidence we have indicates that the decline in tooth decay has been greater in those countries which have not fluoridated than it has been in countries like the United States and Britain, to a limited extent, and the United States to a great extent have fluoridated. Professor Teosha in India has a point. He found, over a period of 30 years, he and his colleagues examined 400,000 children's teeth in India, and he found that the opposite to what is usually believed is the case, that the more fluoride there was, the more decay. And that was exactly the finding of Professor Steelink in Tucson, Arizona, that when they looked at all the children's teeth in Tucson, the more fluoride there was in their neighborhood, their water supply, the more cavities they had in their teeth. So it could be that it's been an even bigger blunder than we thought, and that in some societies it actually has a reverse effect and worsens teeth rather than makes them better.
I'm hoping that citizens who get hold of this videotape in the United States and possibly elsewhere, who are dealing with dentists who go in front of the public and say fluoride is definitely good for teeth and there is no evidence whatsoever that it causes any health problems. What would you say to those dentists? Well, what would be your message to American dentists who, for probably good intentions, no evil implied, no devious implications, what would you say to those dentists?
Well, as I once was, they're sincerely misled and misguided, and they really believe in. If you cross-examine them and they don't like that, they always run away from debate. One hallmark of the fluoridationists is they run away from debate. I didn't when I was a fluoridation. I seemed to get away with it, but I wouldn't like to be doing it today, because the evidence has become much stronger against fluoridation than it was when I was young. I think that the professional education they receive conditions them to accept their authorities rather than make independent judgments themselves. You know, they're taught that this is the accepted orthodoxy. This is what our experts say is the case, and it's a state of mind which I think shows a defect in the nature of our professional education.
I want to thank you on behalf of lots and lots of people in our country and around the world who have admired your courage for saying, I had one position, I think I was wrong, and now I've got a different position. That takes a lot of courage, I think. Schopenhauer said, every new idea is first ridiculed, then it is violently attacked, and then it is accepted as being self-evident. I think as we move into the 21st century, it will become self-evident that putting this toxic material, fluoride, into the drinking water was a very silly idea. And if that does come about, the person that we've spoken to today, John Colquhoun, will have played a very big part in that history. This is Paul Connett from Auckland, New Zealand. Thank you very much for watching.